Matthew, what a pleasure to have you, Matthew. Matthew Contos, you responded to our open call at the University of the Underground. And so we're so grateful to have you on board. And also, I would like to ask everyone here to be extremely supportive of you, because as for all of us, you are involved with the event industry or exhibitions or freelance creative, and you have been, like all of us, extremely heavily impacted by the current crisis. So we are all in this together, and so I'm so grateful for your time actually sharing with us your knowledge. You have an MFA in social practice from California College of the Arts, a BFA in studio art from the University of Denver, and for over a decade you have worked as an artist curator in partnership with diverse groups and organizations to address socioeconomic inequities via alternative education, social services, and community organizing. And Matthew, you are tuning in today from Santa Fe. Thank you so much. And you're going to give us a class on anarchism and art practices.
All right. Well, thank you. Like you just heard, my name is Matthew. Thank you all for being here. This is definitely the first time I've taught to a bunch of little squares, but I guess it's better than like a conference call. So thanks for showing up virtually. That's really great. Let's see. Well, you did a nice intro. Thank you for that. Yeah, so this class is basically about the intersection of art and anarchism. I'm going to read to you a little bit. I'll definitely be showing you guys some videos. And the basic kind of structure of the class is the first part, I'll kind of introduce just the principal themes, which is going to be, of course, art and anarchism. I'll give you a very, very brief analysis on Emma Goldman's life, like crazy brief, because she's fascinating and has done a lot of really impressive things that I wish we had time to cover. Speaking of which, this class I've taught in different ways. Typically, it's done in like 5 one-hour sessions, so it's going to be dense. So buckle up. I hope it's good. In terms of rules, send questions, I guess, through chat is probably the best and the easiest since there's so many of us. We'll go from kind of an introduction to history, and then I'll move into what I'm calling comparative case studies, and I'll explain a little bit more about that before I jump in. And then we'll just do a Q&A. I think that's also probably easiest in chat. Yeah, I've been doing meetings like this with people and I can never tell who's about to say something. So maybe if you just put questions in there, then I can just answer them. Hopefully I can get to all of them. Anyhow, I guess before I jump in, I think it would just kind of be remiss of me not to at least acknowledge our shared and bizarre experience of now living in a pandemic, which is a surreal word to me anyhow. And I hope you're all okay. I have no answers about this. A friend of mine called me the other day and was just saying, what do we do? And I said, I really don't know why you think I can answer that. But I do think there are some interesting things to consider. For me, these times, especially when we see our systems kind of failing us, it can be super scary. Historically, though, I think these times are also exactly when we get to change things. Vulnerable systems mean we can manipulate them for better or worse. So with anarchism in mind, it's kind of a nice time to think about what kind of world we want to live in. So I hope you're all in some way with your practices or in your lives or your families, just considering what could be next. Yeah, what else is there to say about COVID? Anyhow, so as we said, this is the class. Yeah, so I jumped into this when I saw the proposal. It was my partner actually sent it to me, and she saw the quote, if I can't dance, I don't want to be a part of your revolution. And she got excited and said, hey, there's people who make art and they're also talking about anarchism, which is surprisingly rare in my experience. I know a lot of anarchists who talk about art, but in most of the institutions I've worked for or maybe studied in, anytime I bring up anarchism, there's kind of an initial shock or even a resistance. So when I saw this, I was just so excited. I've taught this class before, but I was told to leave out anarchism in other institutions because it was intimidating to the institution. So I'm really grateful to have this chance just to kind of merge it completely. Cool. So we will start off with Emma Goldman, of course, the heroine who ultimately says this quote and where it comes from. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to read to you guys a little bit. So Emma Goldman was an anarchist, a political activist, and a writer. She played a pivotal role in the development of anarchist political philosophy in North America and Europe in the first half of the 20th century. She was born in the Russian Empire in what is now Lithuania to a Jewish family. She immigrated to the United States in 1885, motivated to join the American anarchist efforts after the Chicago Haymarket Fair. She became a writer and a renowned lecturer on anarchism, philosophy, women's rights, social issues, and she would attract crowds of thousands. She and her longtime lover and best friend, Alexander Berkman, planned to assassinate industrialist financier Henry Clark Frick. Frick survived the attempt of his life in 1892, and Berkman was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Goldman didn't go to prison for that. She did, however, go to jail several times throughout her life for things that nowadays just seem kind of absurd. She was, for example, arrested at one point for distributing literature about birth control and just advocating for women's reproductive rights. And there's certainly places still that might look down on that, but just to be jailed for spreading that information is a pretty intense way to think about things. And that was in the US. Anyways, in some ways, we have definitely come a long way. So she's probably best known for her quote, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be a part of your revolution." But what's funny about this is, even though it's attributed to her, it's not clear that she actually said those exact words. So best as I could tell, what this really comes from was when she was younger, I think about, I don't know, 15 or so, a teen at least. She was at a dance and loving her dance and having a good time and dancing all night. And she was already part of this anarchist movement. And one of her allies, a fellow anarchist, came up to her and said, "Hey, Emma, you're basically being, you're having too much fun. And anarchists and people who are political should not be having as much fun as you are at this dance." So his exact quote is, he said that she was undignified and that agitators should not dance, especially with not such reckless abandon. And to that, she responds, to some degree, based on her writing, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be a part of your revolution." So that's ultimately the moment where this comes from. And I like this as a kind of point of departure and just thinking about art in general. And we'll come back to that more in the arts conversation. So that's kind of the origin of this quote, and it bounces around, but I think regardless of whether it's exactly that phrasing or not, I've seen it different on t-shirts or coffee mugs or posters or what have you. So these things shift around a lot over history. It's just kind of how it goes. But I do think that however it was rephrased, she'll ultimately really embrace the sentiment. So let's see. So she goes on to write in her autobiography that "I did not believe that a cause which stood for a beautiful ideal, for anarchism, for release and freedom from conventions and prejudice, should demand the denial of life and joy. I insisted that our cause could not expect me to become a nun, and that movement should not be turned into a cloister. If it meant that I do not want it, I want freedom, the right to self-expression, and everybody's right to beautiful, radiant things. Anarchism meant that to me, and I would live it in spite of the whole world, prisons, persecution, everything. Yes, even in spite of the condemnation of my own comrades, I would live my beautiful ideal." So for Goldman and for many, dance is one of many forms of expression that should always exist in complete freedom from social constraints. There was no value to limited self-expression for Goldman-like anarchists. In fact, the very core of anarchism is defined by total uninhibited freedom of self. Moreover, to dance means to be free, to let go and to move as one feels. And the act of dancing is a pure form of beauty. Beauty as a human ideal in the form of dancing or any mode of self-expression should never be oppressed, for it is of the very essence of what it means to be human. In this way, for beauty to exist, it must not be censored, constrained, or limited. For Goldman, anarchism was beauty, where the same goal to ensure the right for everybody to be beautiful, radiant things. Anyhow, so after this dance, a number of things happened in her childhood. Basically, she and her father did not get along. He was very conservative. He had this idea that she, like all other young Jewish women in his mind at the time, should basically cook and make babies, was his presumption. Emma definitely did not like that. Then she was already kind of organizing off on the side and working with her friends in Russia. But once she heard about the Haymarket Square, which is a really important part of anarchist history, which we're really not going to cover, but definitely take a look at that. Ultimately, it's a labor movement that came out of Chicago. There was a bomb that went off during an anarchist rally that the anarchists, at least in my opinion, did not set off. It's the conspiracy is basically the police did it, and then they arrested all these other anarchists and blamed them, even though they weren't there at the time. So she hears about this and this movement that's kind of building in the U.S., and that gets her excited. And also because of that, and because of these problems with her dad, she was feeling like she needed to go, and she did. So she quickly became one of the most famous radical figures in America, whose power with words was sometimes referred to as the sledgehammer. She traveled across the country speaking so passionately that the famed reporter Nellie Bly would dub her a little Joan of Arc. Over the years, Goldman was sent to prison for ideas several times, once for promoting birth control, once for discouraging men from registering for the draft, and once for telling the unemployed workers to take bread from the wealthy. Sorry, I guess that's not implied. So despite her support for female independence, she often found herself at odds with the suffragettes, believing it less important to get women the vote in the systems she viewed as oppressive than to dismantle them entirely. Emma said the right to vote or equal civil rights may be good demands, but true emancipation begins neither at the polls nor in the courts, she said. It begins in a woman's soul. She believed that women need to reject the sexist rules of societies and governments and assert their right to make decisions about their lives and their bodies. Only that, said Goldman, would truly set a woman free. Although she was heterosexual, Goldman was one of the earliest American advocates for gay rights, as well as birth control and the sexual freedom of women. She's quoted to say, "I demand the independence of woman and her right to support herself, to live for herself, to love whoever she pleases and as many as she pleases." She wrote, "I demand freedom for both sexes, freedom of action, freedom in love, and freedom in motherhood." Goldman was a thorn in the side of American authorities for many years. In 1919, they finally declared her American citizenship invalid, and then deported her back to Russia, which had recently had a people's revolution of its own. But what she found in the aftermath was not the utopia of her dreams, but rather another repressive regime willing to crush the rights of its own citizens. Goldman is an anarchist. The term anarchism is complex, mostly because it's a negotiable term that has different meanings for different people. So I'd say we'll jump into anarchism next, but I think the key things to kind of pull away from this, at least for today's conversation, when she talks about things like marriage, which she writes a lot about and was actually very against marriage, some of that comes from her frustrations with her father. She was actually married, I think a few times, typically for visa statuses or just kind of out of convenience. What she's ultimately talking about is she's resisting any institution that has some sense of a power or control over her or anybody, which is essentially the core value of anarchism, which sounds a little bit almost impossible or utopian-esque, and indeed, I think it is. So before I jump in, if you guys have any questions about Emma real quick, let me know. That was really brief. If you have any interest in her at all, go dig deep. There's so much that she wrote about herself. There's amazing footage of her. There's lots of great films. In the US, she was called, like, I think the most dangerous woman, something like that. She really literally just scared the shit out of this whole country, at least those who couldn't understand what she was talking about. But if you contextualize it a little bit, I mean, this is, think of, like, 1920s. What she's talking about is such a radical idea. This idea of not having, say, the church influence your life or the state tell you what you can do, especially if you're a woman. And she's ahead of these things in lots and lots of ways. So anyhow, definitely look closer at Emma Goldman, and she'll come up as I kind of go through these other projects. You'll see her name come in and out of the conversation we'll have. And it's because she's just so incredibly powerful and had a really far reach. All right, so we'll get into anarchism. If you're wondering, I do identify as an anarchist. If you want to get super specific about it, I would say I lean more towards the anarcho-syndicalists, which is not as deep as we're going to go into it. But that's also where I like to start when I think about anarchism. There's no one anarchism. There's no, like, one way to be an anarchist. There are core principles that kind of translate across all of the groups. There's some things that I'm sure if you were to think right now, you all have your own perceptions and relationships to either the term anarchism or the term anarchy. These are different things. That's another important distinction to make. So anarchy is a state of things. So most people would think, chaos, and that's true. Anarchy can definitely relate to chaos. Anarchism, like most isms, is an ideology or a philosophy that can then be manifested through your life, how you interact with the world, how you interact with people, or just, your own values and what they're developed on. So as I explain anarchism, it's just important to know that this is kind of my version of it. I came to anarchism mostly through labor unions, like the Industrial Workers for the World or the IWW. I've run collective spaces that were all consensus run and very anarchist driven. Some were real successful, some were not. So that's kind of how I've come to it. And I would say everything about anarchism is like a gamble in terms of participation. And that's, to me, the most important, beautiful thing about it, is just like art, you can define it, and it changes and it adapts and it grows and it becomes its own thing. It can become something different depending on who's in the room. So if you've ever worked with anarchists, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. There's lots of fighting amongst anarchists. That's also part of it. It's like one of these things that just comes with the territory. I imagine if any of you are anarchists or are very politically motivated, I'm going to say things you will not agree with, and please feel free to argue with me later in the questions, because I think that's important. That's how knowledge is exchanged. So I love a good argument. Anyhow, so what is anarchism? I grabbed this image. It's not really the greatest image, but I think what's nice about it is you'll see, like, here's a great usual trope of an anarchist is the Molotov cocktail. I'm going to show you videos of people throwing flaming bottles at state buildings by the end of today. It's a normal thing to see. So, but that is not the defining quality. In fact, I'd say anarchism is usually against violence and usually looks at it as a sense of weakness in terms of if you're on the offense. Usually violence for anarchists is kind of this thing you do when you have to. I'm personally non-violent, but when possible, but to be honest, I totally believe that if you need to defend yourself based on whatever you believe in, be violent. The state is violent. The world is violent. Oppression comes with violence. In fact, that's how it works. And All right, I'm trying not to get on my soapbox here. Anyhow, so other things you can see in here, of course, there's the anti-Nazi or fascist movements. The black cat, that's actually a union IWW logo. I'm really glad someone put the carrot in here, because most of the anarchists I know are like gentle farmers. And all they want to do is like read and have a homestead and not be bothered. They hate the idea of, you know, most of their life being dominated by earning a living. And it's, which I get. I actually love to work. I don't agree with the wage aspect of it, though. I do think it's excellent to work. I just think we should be able to choose what that is. And I don't think that our work should dictate whether or not we have access to things like food or shelter, healthcare, these kind of things. Anyhow, sorry, my screen is, I am not great at this system. Okay, this image is basically a depiction of capitalism, which you can enjoy. Hopefully, if it stays put. Yeah. All right, so in general, anarchism is a political philosophy that argues that the state is lacking in moral legitimacy. Because of this, individuals are under no obligation to obey the state, and the state has no authority to command individuals. Anarchism is generally about the rejection of a government and rule. It suggests that society can and should be organized without a coercive state. Anarchists ultimately reject hierarchy and focus on the power of the individual. They believe that all individuals can do what they choose, up to the point of interfering with what others choose. They can have numerous worldviews and ideologies. That's really true. I know anarchist nuns, I know anarchist farmers, I know anarchist teachers, I know capitalist anarchists or anarcho-capitalists. That's a real thing, which seems really in conflict with each other. We're not going down that rabbit hole, but it's another interesting one to go down if you like this kind of stuff. Yeah. So the term anarchy comes from the Greek word anarchos, which means without ruler, and anarchia, which means without government. But anarchy is a term that most of us today associate with chaos and disorder. So just think about what you see on TV when you see the anarchists. Typically it is the Molotov cocktail, it's, you know, people throwing trash cans through banks, and the anarchist argument against that is quite literally the state trying to out us as terrorists, when for the most part, as I hope you'll see in the examples I show you later, it's really peaceful, and it's so much about just caring for each other. So to carry on, anarchism is utopian. It is a fantasy of sorts of a perfectly liberated world where all things are equal, balanced, harmonized, peaceful, fair, or for lack of better terms, perfect. So this idea of utopia is another fun concept we could do lots of classes on. But in terms of utopia, the way at least I've always translated is utopias never exist as a concept. It can't. It's the thing that you're always pointing towards, but it's not necessarily the thing you're getting to. And so for anarchists and for anarchism, I take the whole philosophy as a utopian idea. That it's, I always just picture it as a horizon line, and you're walking towards it. And every step you take, it goes back further one step. Along the way, you can still get closer and achieve things that are utopian-like. So for example, you might have the perfectly balanced anarchist commune. However, if you own the land, you're still paying taxes to the state. And that's a complicated thing to sort out. But with that in mind, for me, the idea of anarchism is ultimately to do our best to apply anarchist principles to daily life. And anarchist principles are diverse. There's a lot of different ways to talk about it. The main one is kind of individuality. And that's based on the idea that we are naturally our own people. We don't need the state to tell us who we are or to direct us on who we are. Whether we like it or not, you know, at least I know on my birth certificate, my parents were Lutheran, which is a Christian denomination. I'm no longer that. But I was like immediately baptized and put into this church, right? So immediately in our lives, we have these things going on that throw you into a state, into a structure. And this kind of carries on to the point where thinking about a life without it is so foreign. It can really, I think, confuse people. So anarchism is actually made for a different type of living all the time and anywhere. So let's see. The anti-capitalist thing, just kind of as a side note, because this is more for the examples I'll show you later. A lot of what I'm going to show you is anti-capitalist. This is a capitalist structure. I think it's a great visual. You'll see that you have people on top. This kind of works out more like a monarchy in this version. At least they look that way, but that could be a prime minister, that could be a king or queen. But what I really like about this capitalism model is they're still not the ones totally dominating everything. It's the money. And so capitalism is about money. It's a system in which there's no way to profit unless you're profiting off of someone. So just think about that. Every time you spend money, someone lost something. That's what profit is. It is gaining at someone else's expense or at something else's expense. You can, you know, turn a beautiful tree into a chair. It's at the expense of a tree. You can eat an orange. That's at the expense of somebody's labor. Someone picked that, someone may have watered that or whatever. Now that doesn't mean that we'll never live in a world that you don't have something at the expense of another thing. That's always going to be constant. The difference is this system is built to prosper in the more exploitation that you have. Another interesting thing about coronavirus is, at least in the States, I'm seeing a lot of middle-class people realize that they're really not the wealthy, and they thought they might have been. And now that their stable incomes have been pulled from them, they're identifying more with might be the working poor or just the poor, or in some cases, just, you know, completely homeless people. And that's really powerful in terms of movements. Anyhow, so as you go down, you have things like clergy, which these days, I don't think it's always clergy. I think these roles have been fulfilled by all kinds of different people, whether it's military, whether it's some celebrity. There's different ways of kind of thinking about this next structure down. This third part down is basically the violent part. These are police, this is the military. At all times with oppression, you need to have a threat of violence. For example, if you speed, you get a ticket. If you get too many tickets, eventually you can go to jail, or we can take away your resources. If I say get enough fines and they say, they being the state or the police, instead of taking me to jail, they can come eventually and take, say, my car or my house. That is a form of violence, to deprive you of the things you have. And I couldn't do anything about it, at least within that system. So when I say things like oppression and violence, I'm also speaking to these models. Underneath that is usually this kind of lovely middle class that has this perception that they're in charge. They're typically not as in charge as they think they are, but they do generate money. They're kind of the bosses. They're kind of that world. I'm a boss, technically, so I'm not anti any of these things. This is the world we live in. And then, of course, there's labor and everybody else, and that's the bottom. And so these are the people who are typically unseen. And again, and coronavirus days, it's one of the things I hope to see more people recognize. You know, our essential workers, as we're calling them, are people who are typically making minimum wage, who don't have healthcare, at least in the US. And they're really very vulnerable populations, yet we're calling them essential. To me, that doesn't add up. It just feels like automatically wrong. Okay, so anarchism sits, ooh, that's a bad image, sorry about that. Okay, so this is, I kind of like this model. It has issues because it's two-dimensional, but anyways, it's a good place to start. So in like a very centralist neutral theme is kind of the middle. You can see that, See, top left, you have personal liberty as a value. Top right, economic liberty. Bottom right is personal security, and bottom left, economic security. So you can see by these symbols, the swastika is a nice obvious one. There's the Democrats and Republicans are kind of along that middle line. Anarchism sits at kind of the apex of personal liberty and economic liberty and pretty much liberty in general. The complete opposite of anarchism would be tyranny, feudalism, those kind of worlds where you have no choices, no security, and it's all dependent on basically permission from a higher power, whether it be clerical or authoritative. So you can also see there's, there's communism down here. There's variations of communism. And, there's republics. There's a whole spectrum here that takes forever to go through. I think it's important to mention that anarchism is ultimately a form of socialism. It's just a more radicalized form of it. Cool. So that's the very quick gist of anarchism, but I'll leave you with, let's see if I can find it. Yeah, I'll leave you with kind of my very reduced version of it, of how I would define anarchism. So anarchism prioritizes humans, living creatures, and the planet above governments, money, institution, or social constructs. It's that simple. That's how I do it. That's how I think about it. When I write it out, it's like, people, greater sign, any social construct. And by social construct, I mean anything we have created as a society that doesn't exist in nature, like say a school or a law or a border. I do side work, I can tell you guys more about later, that we're working on basically trying to get refugees out of detention centers. So the US is horrible at immigration policy. You have people who are literally fleeing war, horrible violence. I mean, just things that will break your heart. And the second they get to the border seeking asylum, they're treated like criminals, in some cases even worse. Our detention center system in the US is privatized, which means it makes money. The more people it has in there, the more money it makes. Same with our prison system here. And that's a really good example of capitalism and how it impacts our world. And it will always prioritize money over human life. There's lots of ways to kind of enter that, but I think in the US context especially, you can really see the racist form of the prison system that is driven by capitalism. Yes, the US system is racist, without a doubt. And you can see that because it's filled predominantly with Black and Latino male youth. I've worked in prisons for years. Anyhow, what you'll find is these private owned prisons want police to put more bodies in there because they keep making more money. They take that money, they put it into a politician's pocket. That politician then may or may not get elected. He has more money to campaign or take out his opponent, and so on and so on. And this becomes this interlinking network of power that if you're just, on the bottom of that kind of capitalist structure I showed you, you don't have that power. You're just subject to it. So, like I said, yes, I'm an anarchist. I'm also an artist, curator, art administrator, done social work, that kind of stuff. But from the art stance and for this class, the thing we really want to get to is, I'll do this quickly, is I'm not talking about art as a whole. In fact, I think if you talk about art as a whole, it's kind of naive. Art's negotiable, just like anarchism, also equally appealing to me. So in the context of this class, what I'm really talking about is social art, which is still a term that there's lots of them. It's socially engaged art, community-based arts, new genre, public art, community as art, social sculpture, social form. It's a highly debated term. And really, I think it was just coined maybe since late 90s, so not that long. I'd say about a year ago, Wikipedia wouldn't even mess with this, but I was surprised. I just kind of Googled it and saw this definition this morning, and I think it's pretty good. So social artists are people who use creative skills to work with people or organizations in their community to affect change. That's not true of all social artists, but for today's class, that makes sense. While a traditional artist uses the creative skills to express their take on the world, the social artist puts their skills to use to help promote and improve communities. Thus, the main aim of the social artist is to improve society as a whole and to help other people find their own means of a creative expression. Sounds super utopian. Artists will save the world, and also highly debatable if that's even possible. Um, I think this is a pretty good definition. I don't actually believe all people who are making what I consider social art do have the intention to make positive change. A lot of social practice or social artists are actually interested in just pointing out the problems. There's a lot of art out there that will just say, hey, there's poverty in Mexico, or there's this problem in Oakland, or whatever it might be. And that is useful. It's good to know the problem. I'm personally more interested in artists who are thinking about solutions. So I'd say some key things to kind of think about with this is the process is really important. How you get to that process, or how you get to the work. In some cases, the process is even more important than the work itself. So what I mean by that is, if you say, we're going to create a community artwork for everybody, the social artist is going to ask, well, how did they have input? What was their power? Yeah. So I think other good things to talk about are that it's not necessarily an object, and the work is not necessarily about the artist. In fact, the social art world tends to reject that. Yeah. So the social form is kind of its own thing, and it's basically an idea that the collection of human relationships and the systems that govern our behaviors and rituals are able to be manipulated, like clay, paint, or any other medium. This is how artists have justified this as art. So if you can move around clay and use it as a metaphor, you can create a new form. Social artists look at our world in the things that create it. So for example, laws, stop signs, these things we literally make up and just agree on. Currency, the US dollar is backed by nothing. It's an imaginary thing we just agree on. It's an agreed value. So the social artist looks at that as a point of entry. It's something you can have an intervention with in a relationship too. And if you can manipulate it for better or worse, then you can actually produce culture with the systems that are naturally doing it anyways. So yeah, let's see, where are we at on time? Cool, I want to leave some time for questions later, so I'm gonna kind of burn through the social art part. Anyhow, so that's kind of the gist on social art and anarchism. Why I like these two things being related is because I think they're similar. I think the social artist is looking at the art institution and saying, something's not right here. I can't go and say, I'm going to work with this community in poverty, say, take photos in some rural area of starving children. We'll just be extreme with the example. And then take that to, say, a Manhattan gallery, and then build a career, and then sell that work. And then the economy of the gallery boosts, the economy of the artist boosts. Meanwhile, these kids you were so worried about, these hungry kids you had to photograph, they're just still sitting there without food in their bellies. And so that's the kind of problem that social artists are up against. It's really hard to do this work ethically within the context of the current art world.